All right, everybody, welcome to our next developer livecast here on the Game Wisdom YouTube channel. As always, I am Josh Blaser, and we have got a very great one today. We're going to be talking about King of Dragon Pass and its spiritual follow-up, Six Ages. The original King of Dragon Pass is often regarded as one of the best games ever made thanks to its combination of strategy and storytelling. And it's a game that has become very popular for after-action reports and for being just a very unique take on those designs. And joining me tonight is the designer on it as well as on the upcoming Six Ages. So please welcome from A Sharp, David Dunham.
Hi Josh, thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you on, David, and thank you so much for agreeing to come on for our little chat today.
My pleasure.
We were just talking about this before, but David was originally on the East Coast, and it's always great to talk to people who've been around here.
It's across the river from you.
Yeah. But how are you doing today?
Oh, pretty good. I think it's a lot cooler here than Cherry Hill right now.
Yeah, I think so. I think maybe you're right on that front. We've been having that lovely heat wave. And, of course, hopefully it will be finally settling in at least another month or so. We're in the middle of it now, so fingers crossed on that front. But we've certainly got a lot to talk about here today, and for folks watching this live right now, if you have any questions for David regarding King of Dragon Pass, Six Ages, or just the general design, definitely feel free to leave them in the comments. But before we get into more of the nitty-gritty about the design, since this is your first time on, for people watching us who may not have heard of King of Dragon Pass or A Sharp, could you talk a little bit about your background and kind of what is this game that we're going to be talking about tonight?
Well, King of Dragon Pass, it's a little hard to summarize because there's pretty much no other game like it except now Six Ages. But it's basically a storytelling game that the stories are hung together on the skeleton of a resource management game or a strategy game, turn-based strategy. And it's sort of the opposite of the typical design where a story is sort of pasted onto a strategy game to make it more cool and interesting and more emotional. But here the stories are really the major element. The economy is pretty critical too. You don't want to starve, and you want to be wealthy enough that you have influence in story situations. It's also set in the mythical world of Glorantha, which Greg Stafford created years and years ago, and it's been seen in tabletop role-playing games like RuneQuest and HeroQuest and 13th Age now. It's very, very detailed. I think probably only Middle-earth has more words written about it. But in King of Dragon Pass, we focused on just the stuff you need to know, and everything else is sort of out there in the peripheral vision, helping make it feel more like a real live world.
Mm-hmm. And as you said, David, not too many games, I mean, I couldn't even think of anything else, has really tried to combine that kind of storytelling device with, as you said, the resource management side of things. And as I said just before as we started this up, there have been a lot of people who have played this game and of course have written multiple ARs kind of about their own experiences and just how well this kind of design has lent itself to storytelling.
Yeah, it solves some of the problems that a standard, what looks to some people like a choose your own adventure game, but it really isn't, because if you have a game like that, you're going to end up with a zillion branches. And you run into the combinatorial explosion. Either you have to ignore the branches effectively, or you run into plenty of content that no one ever sees. And by having your decisions all have a consequence, but it's partly story and partly economic, they can be kind of strung together in a lot more variety of different orders, and you get kind of an emergent narrative. The context is usually quite different from the same scene. A clan in both games may come to visit you. They may have a problem involving one of like their own individuals, and just because they're a neighbor, in one game you started, they might be a friendly neighbor, and another they might be a less friendly neighbor. So the situation is nominally the same, but the context makes it, well, are we going to help a friend, or are we going to, yeah, we're not going to do anything for these guys. So pretty much every game is going to be quite different, even though they have sort of an overall story arc towards a dramatic narrative conclusion.
Mm-hmm. And using the term emergent design is very interesting because or that emergent narrative, because again, we see very similar things to that in the game XCOM, which is another very popular game for ARs, and kind of trying to create a personality to something that technically the player doesn't quote unquote exist in the game. Like, you're not playing as a named character, you're not playing as the hero, you're just you essentially, and the world itself responds and kind of revolves around your decision making.
Yeah, and in the story games I've done, you're not there at all as a person. You're the spirit of the clan, and the characters are sort of your playing pieces. They do have their own personalities, but you're not there as a entity per se. We do try to bring you into the world as much as possible, so you feel like that's you there, but no, you're not an agent in the world directly.
Mm-hmm. Now, with the overall design of King of Dragon Pass, I know it's been quite a few years since that game came out, but where did like the idea for it came from, like creating the game around this kind of structure?
So actually, I was thinking about that this morning, and I believe it was really because I was playing a game called Castles, which was about building castles, and then you defend them against attackers. And there were a very small number of story situations. I think Scott Benny wrote them for the game. And the game was totally fine, but what really was compelling to me were these story situations. Like, the villagers think there's a werewolf and they're going to stop construction. What do you do? And there may be I only remember like there was 5 of these in the game. There's probably a little more, but that to me was the interesting part of the game. And so I sort of turned it on its head. And I think around that time was reading Greg Stafford's novel King of Sartar and realizing that Glorantha would be a great setting for a game of the type like this. I was talking to Greg, and he thought it was a pretty cool idea too. And I'm trying to remember the Hidden Agenda, I think, was the game that he was heavily influenced by, that you have advisors, and that fit very well with his world of Glorantha, that in an Orlanthe society you have a clan ring of 7 people, and those became your advisors on the bottom of the King of Dragon Pass screen, and the story part became the dominant thing. And then we tried to figure out what a clan would have to worry about as they were resettling Dragon Pass. So that kind of drove the fact you had cows and you had to feed yourself by growing crops, and the fact you had neighbors, and one of your important things you manage is your relationship with your neighbors.
Mm-hmm. And with the actual setting that you've taught about, and as you said, it's a very recognized setting. It's been used in other games. Was that part of the decision from the offset to use that as a setting for King of Dragon Pass, or were there other worlds like thrown around during the development?
I guess my very first idea was to make it an Icelandic saga game set in Viking era Iceland, but I think the fact that Glorantha had magic and had gods, and it sort of fit a typical game a little bit better. You have in King of Dragon Pass, the magic form sort of the skill tree as you build up your relations with the gods and learn new magic as you build shrines and temples. And it was also it wasn't maybe a very, very well-known license, but a lot of people had played RuneQuest, and I figured it would be a recognizable name if we did a Glorantha game.
And one thing that I wanted to touch on that you mentioned there, David, is regarding having the console, the Ring of Seven, because this is one of the more interesting aspects of King of Dragon Pass. Again, we really don't see even like other strategy games really go for. Now, obviously, most strategy games will have advisors, your AI assistants who will tell you need more food, your army is small, you should build more of that. But what kind of set King of Dragon Pass apart is the fact that there's more of a personality to these seven, and the fact that you're they're essentially your entire they're the majority of your UI in a sense. It's not like I can go to a screen and see exactly what everything is. At least for like more of the advanced features. Instead, you have to talk to these people, and then that information is kind of filtered through their AI or their own personality that was built into it. And I guess what was it like, or what kind of design decisions came about with designing the console around that way?
Well, some of it was sort of a Gloranthan thing that the clan ring is supposed to represent 7 different gods for the maximum effect, and also the fact that the gods themselves have sort of a specialty sort of implied that you choose ring members with a specialty. So you would have a war god on your representative on your clan ring, and they would give you war-related advice. You'd have a representative of the farmer god on the clan ring, and they'd give you food-related advice, etc. And we also gave them skills because they are, in effect, your clan officers, and they will execute your decisions. If you send off your warriors on a brief raid, your best combat person on your clan ring is the one who leads it, and they're the one who will be tested to see if they can succeed or not. So you're trying to balance a bunch of things. You want good skills on your clan ring, but you also want a variety of deities on your clan ring. And as it happens, they're people, and people aren't always necessarily, exactly predictable. And just because you worship the war god, you're probably not the kindest person in the world, but you still have a personality in the game, and you may have specific likes and dislikes. And occasionally, people on your clan ring will go off and do things on their own because they're people. Mm-hmm. And that's also something I haven't really seen in a lot of games.
Yeah. And I agree with you on that, David. I know when we were talking about this on email, you haven't kept too much ahead of some of the games that have been coming out lately, but there's this one game by John Schaefer who did Civilization 5, either 5 or 4. I apologize to John if he's watching this recorded right now.
That's Barbarians at the Gates you're talking?
Yeah, At the Gates that he's working on. And that was like when I was hearing about that game, he was again saying how the various clan members had these personalities that would be directly influencing their abilities or skills. I think we brought up King of Dragon Pass during our conversation about that. Because as you said, we really don't see this convergence of strategy and storytelling or character personality in a lot of these games.
Yeah, it's actually sort of, I wouldn't say fractal, but it goes up and down the scale, mm-hmm. because the other clans in the game also have personalities. And for example, in the King of Dragon Pass story, you are trying to form a tribe by joining other clans with you. So one of the reasons it's not a conquest game, because you have to make a political union. But when you're talking to the other clans, Robin Laws came up with basically different personalities for the clans. So you might be talking to the clan that really values trade, or the clan that actually kind of likes trolls, or a clan that they have huge herds but they aren't really good at fighting. So you might want to balance a clan like that with a warlike raiding clan. So personality is really pretty key in the game.
Mm-hmm. Now, one thing that I saw while I was reading people doing AARs about King of Dragon Pass is the idea of sending your various clan members out on hero quests or these special missions that will either aid them or give them more renown. What was the design decision to have kind of like this way of improving your followers or giving them even more depth as the game progressed?
I think that was sort of a side thing that came out of, well, if we're going to be in Glorantha, yeah, there's gods, but one of the key things about Greg's mythology is that you have a way to visit them. I mean, in a Greek mythology game, the gods come around and do things, but you don't really go visit the gods if you're someone like an Ajax or Odysseus. Mm-hmm. So in Glorantha, you do have a way to visit the other side. You can walk in the footsteps of your god, and if you do it right, you can gain a lot of the powers that your god had. And you have a map to these footsteps, which are the myths that are shown in the game. And it just seemed like it was sort of a secondary system that fit into everything else, because you'd be going to the other world either potentially to improve your warriors abilities or gain a herd of cows. You could end a drought. It all can tie back to that economic model that helps sort of glue things together and give them context and meaning. And it was just a way to help reinforce that this is a world of myth, and that isn't just like myths the way we often use it today as a little false story we tell. In Glorantha, the myths are very real.
And speaking of those myths, another way of properly displaying them, of course, is the very impressive art that was in King of Dragon Pass, and those very well detailed images. Like, for those of you watching this either live or recorded right now, I chose that scene of just like throwing that guy across the screen there as kind of the promo art, because I always get a kick out looking at that. I guess, where did the art or the aesthetic for King of Dragon Pass come from?
We certainly looked at an awful lot of Osprey books. That was something we did at the start, was sort of brainstorm an art look, sort of based on the fact that the game is set in Dragon Pass, and Dragon Pass is pretty high elevation and the winters are bitterly cold. So we kind of thought that Icelandic people were dressed for kind of cold winters, and that was sort of a more or less a baseline of the art style. But the Orlenthi are not Vikings, they're not Celts. We took a bunch of different visual influences and mixed them up together. We needed also some storytelling things that you could identify people quite easily. So you had to be able to tell our Orlanthi from the northern Orlanthi that might visit you, or from the people in the south who might visit you, or from total foreigners who do show up as well. The other big art style thing was there's 3 major art styles in the game that are functional also in nature. At the beginning of the game, you go through a clan questionnaire, which gives you the backstory of your clan and sets up some of the conditions you try to stay true to, or even your victory conditions. And that's the distant past, so it's a specific art style. It's kind of a woodcut look. Then we have the present, which is sort of more like a European graphic novel look. And then when you visit the other world, or you're reading about the other world in the lore section, that's a much more larger-than-life type of look to show that it's not the regular world.
Yeah. And it all just still looks amazing. I think it still holds up really well. For people who are fans of Game Wisdom, I always have an appreciation for that kind of hand-drawn look, where it is in like older books, older animation, and stuff along those lines. I always think it has that sense of timelessness to it.
Yeah, it was sort of our cheat in a way, that the game could continue to have a life because we had infinite polygons. And if you look at any other game from 1999, it's probably not even going to look like pixel art. It's just going to look bad today.
Yeah. And
we did win the Best Art Award at the 2nd Independent Games Festival. So I'm really happy my artist did a great job.
Now, as you were just saying, regarding designing the different styles, and especially the different kinds of UIs used in King of Dragon Pass, I really wanted to touch on this from a design perspective, because one of the more challenging aspects of strategy game design is just knowing how to properly give the player information, and also what kind of information they should be told at any given point. Because there's always that fine line you have to walk between either giving the player too much information that it just overwhelms them, or giving them too little and they're just left scratching their heads as to what should I be doing in this game. And with something like King of Dragon Pass, you also have the third challenge of, again, tying this into this narrative and to this emergent storytelling with the Ring of Seven, and kind of matching things along those lines.
Yeah, the division into the sort of different management screens, we call them. So if you are interested in the war status of your clan, you'd go to the war screen and you can launch raids or recruit more warriors. Your magic is all in one place. Trade related stuff is all in one place. And that also was a way to help focus the advice. A lot of the information is on the screen, the raw numbers, but sometimes things like, yeah, you can see you have a lot of shrines and temples, but you have to pay a maintenance cost for that. And rather than put that up on the screen and make it more cluttered, since it's not something you always need, it was something that an advisor would tell you about. And likewise, they might remind you about how you're getting low on cows or you're low on oxen to plow your fields. You have plenty of cows, but you don't have oxen. And that's something that seemed like an advisor would be able to explain it, because otherwise we'd have to come up with maybe symbols or something, and then you have to learn what the symbols mean. There was only so much room back in those days. Our nominal screen size was 640 by 480 when we first did the game. It was probably could have been a little bigger by the time it came out, but it was a pretty good choice in 1997 when we began.
And I just love the fact that we're talking about Dragon Pass, and again, it came out in '99, and it's always interesting to see just how much things have changed, and excuse me, my voice is starting to go as well. How things have evolved in terms of its design. And again, as we said, or as we haven't said yet, with a game like King of Dragon Pass, this came out long before the era of digital distribution and being able to patch and update games very easily along those lines. I guess, how was the initial feedback? Because I originally didn't hear about King of Dragon Pass until at least the mid-thousands, when I had fans and various websites I visited were doing the AARs on it.
It was certainly a challenge as an indie. I mean, we didn't intend to be an indie. We had hoped to find a publisher, and we went to game developer conferences and tried to shop it around, and they kind of said, this is a nice game, but it's kind of a niche game. It probably won't sell that much. I think the problem there was that a niche game was hard to sell because you were selling to the buyers at physical retail stores, and they were kind of looking for they need a role-playing game for this month and a strategy game for this month and a sports game for this month. Which one do you have for me? And this wasn't any one of those, really. So we ended up having to publish the game ourselves, which was an interesting learning experience about how to make boxed games and get them rated. And we had the side benefit from having worked with Greg Stafford and Glorantha that we had a in on the hobby distribution where games like RuneQuest were sold. So we were able to ship physical boxes into the hobby distribution system. It turned out that if you wanted to be in the game distribution business, not only did you have to worry about those categories, but you basically had to buy shelf space in the United States. And we were an indie, and we can't buy shelf space. That costs a lot of money. So we didn't sell a lot of boxed copies in the United States. We did sell a lot more in Finland because distribution in Finland is quite different, and apparently all you have to do is demand a game and stores will get it. It doesn't have to be pushed on them with money. And we got a really great review in Pelit, their primary game magazine, and fans were kind of asking people, where do I buy this game? It's like a 94 rating or something. Editor's choice, where do we buy it? So we were able to ship boxes to Finland. But in general, unless you were a Finnish person, you probably didn't hear about the game because we were a tiny indie.
Mm-hmm. And I remember, like, for a time, it was very hard to find King of Dragon Pass. Again, we're talking, like, mid-thousands, before, the likes of GOG, and even before Steam really got going. I remember, I forget if this was with A Sharp or if it was another developer, but I remember somebody was like actually offering, like, if you email us or if you email us directly, we'll just print out a copy or we'll mail it to you like that. Did A Sharp do that?
We were certainly one like that. We'd run out of copies. Printing CDs and boxes is not cheap, and if you have to print them in large print runs and store them in a warehouse that costs monthly, we did 2 printings and then ran out because even in those days games were really front loaded and all the copies went out towards the beginning. But we still had fans wanting it, so sure, burn a CD. And yeah, this was before GOG and anything like that.
Mm-hmm. And we'll be talking more about kind of bringing King of Dragon Pass back with mobile and sort of the revised version in a few minutes. But keeping with more of the design talk, for at least I have a few more questions for you, David. I guess, again, going back to the fact the game was released in 1999, again, before, we did talk about games as a service and continued support and things along those lines. With that initial release, did A Sharp kind of like put in everything that was like wanted into King of Dragon Pass, or did anything get like left on the cutting room floor at that time?
Oh, I suppose in one sense, the main thing that got cut was the idea that, you could have multiple players playing clans at the same time. That was sort of always a thing. We kind of figured publishers would ask for it, so there was a little bit of infrastructure in the data structures to deal with that. But I think that actually would have made it a much worse game, even though it's what a lot of strategy games do, of course, because you're playing a story, and how do you coordinate every clan's story so they all come to an exciting point at the same time? So technically that got cut, but it probably should have been cut. But by and large, we were trying to give you, we were burning it onto a CD, and there wasn't really a great way to distribute updates. So we wanted to put everything we could in the box. We did add some scenes, I think in updates there are a few ways we could add a small number of additional scenes, but on the other hand, we targeted that you'd get 40 hours of gameplay out of it. So we figured that was probably, you'd at least be getting good value for what you paid for the box.
Mm-hmm. And as we've said, the game has certainly gone on to become a cold hit among a lot of fans. And again, especially for that kind of emergent storytelling that we discussed a few minutes ago. I guess before we move on to another topic then, David, are there any aspects regarding King of Dragon Pass's design that we didn't touch on that you'd like to bring up?
I think mainly it was just the overall story arc is something I don't think I'd mentioned before, and you do have a goal in King of Dragon Pass, or two goals, because there was a short game as well that kind of truncated it early, so you could kind of learn what was going on and not have to spend quite so much time. But there was that, we have the emergent narrative formed out of hundreds of small stories, but we are trying to build them and pull you in a certain direction so that you can become king or queen of Dragon Pass. And so there's some of the scenes are specifically to tell that story, and the majority are just to tell the story of a small clan that's trying to struggle and survive in a fairly hostile world.
Mm-hmm. Now, talking about things from like that kind of branching narrative point of view, or kind of like, again, the storytelling side, as you said, the scenes or the events in King of Dragon Pass are, for the most part, hard-coded in terms of what's happening in that scene. But as you said, how it plays out in relation to what's going on within your own clan can differ, depending upon if one faction is friendly, how your supply, stuff along those lines. What was it like to kind of balance having these events be both hard-coded but still like malleable in a sense?
Hey, can I take a break? Someone's ringing my doorbell twice.
Okay, sure.
I'll be like 2 minutes. I'm sorry.
All right. All right, folks. Well, I guess we're going to have a quick... That's great. So, I guess while we're waiting for David to get back, we'll be talking more about the kind of what happened with King of Dragon Pass after, in terms of mobile design and then 6 ages. Oh, that was quick.
All right. Sorry about that.
No problem.
So, actually, you said something about events being hard-coded, and they are to a degree, but there's also an awful lot of flexibility in how they are coded, so that they can handle all kinds of situations. There's a ton of conditionals, there's placeholders, there's a little randomness in them, and I think I forgot the rest of what you were talking about.
About kind of having both, like, again, like that hard-coded nature in terms of like the original intent, and then still being malleable enough, as you said, to have like multiple conditions or multiple ways of them playing out.
Yeah, they won't be the same any 2 times, either just because text will be randomized. Sometimes responses aren't available depending on either on things you've done before, or we're not going to give you the choice of offering a gift of some of your valuable goods if you don't have any. I mean, it's kind of pointless to offer something that would always fail. So they are, in a way you could say, oh, S27 is the scene where the visitors from the south show up with their magic instruments, but that's not going to be the same any two times because of the other contextual changes. And that was always the design, because we wanted to have the game, we didn't want to have to write a ton of scenes. We didn't want to have way too much art, but we wanted to have a lot of replay value. So everything was designed to be replayed from the start.
And as you said, with all the I'm assuming there must have been tons and tons of conditionals written for King of Dragon Pass for each one of those scenes, depending upon, again, like, did you do X during this scene? Are your resources at this point now? I guess, as you said earlier, it took about 2 years. You spent, I think, 2 years in development of King of Dragon Pass. Like,
almost 3.
Oh, yeah. How, like, did that take a lot of time to do in terms of coming up with, like, all the various conditional statements and how you wanted these possible events to play out?
No, one of the great things about working with Robin Laws is he could pretty much reliably do 4 scenes every day on an ongoing basis, and that meant not necessarily debugged and working in the game, but it had gone through a sanity check, and we were making sure that conditions made sense. So creating it was fairly, for Robin at least, pretty straightforward. On my best days, I can work that fast on those, but usually not. The problem came when all of these things that all made sense on their own start becoming an emergent narrative, and then you have to worry about, say, one clan comes offering you gifts, and then, well, randomly, what if they come back the next season wanting stuff? That kind of doesn't make any logical sense. Why did they do that? I mean, maybe you could make up stories as to why they did it, but there's things came out in emergent narrative that meant we had to add new conditions or make other little changes. And I know we had a little bit of sort of a much more branching narrative, still not in the completely traditional sense, but there's a couple of stories that have basically you'll make early decisions and be locked out of other choices, and those turned out to be, by comparison, a real QA nightmare, because they were all intricate and still had a lot of that replayability, repeatability in there, but also because nothing is usually instant, other things could happen in the middle, and you didn't want your chief might be killed between 2 scenes, and does that change things? It may not, but it's something we had to deal with as part of the QA process. And I don't remember the exact timing of QA versus the other parts, but it was probably in serious QA for about half that time.
And talking about, again, like, balancing these various events, one thing that we didn't touch on, I think, I definitely want to ask you about, David, is about deciding how much choice or how much power the player has in King of Dragon Pass. Because, as you said, you've built this world and you built all these scenes out of these various events and various conditions, but then you also have the factor of the player in terms of not only the decisions they can make, but the various spells they can cast, the various abilities they'll pick up over the course of a single playthrough. How did A Sharp kind of balance, again, having the player kind of throw their own personal monkey wrench into the story?
Well, the overall thing is we wanted it to be that you were telling a Gloranthan story, so you wouldn't have options that simply wouldn't make sense. I'm not sure what those options would be off the top of my head, but you are playing an agrarian society. You aren't going to try to have political dominance over people that you can barely rule your own clan, because everyone has their own idea how it should be running. But yes, we did want players to have a choice, and typically a scene would have 5 responses, and they all were intended to be of relatively equal merit, just a different consequence that might come about when you chose it. So we tried to balance. You have a lot of Gloranthan choices, but you're making Gloranthan choices.
Hmm. And within those choices, as you said, with it being an agrarian society, that does limit, like, even though the player is given free reign in terms of their own decision making, they're still, I guess, kind of tied to this world. As you said, it's not like a good player is going to somehow evolve into gunpowder or
Right.
do something crazy like that, or conquer the entire land.
Or decide to go sailing off somewhere
Yeah.
because um, oh, I had something and forgot it. Well, come back.
And for folks watching this, if, for anyone who is a fan of King of Dragon Pass, if you have any design questions for us, please get them in the next few minutes because we'll probably move on to the next part of our topic. Probably in the next, I would say maybe in the next 3 or 4 minutes. I think that should be about time. Now, one other question that I have for you regarding, again, this kind of balance of gameplay and storytelling. When A Sharp originally conceived King of Dragon Pass, was this kind of a gameplay loop kind of like set in stone from the offset, or did you experiment with any other gameplay mediums or devices for King of Dragon Pass?
No, I think somehow it was it's almost crystallized as this is I'd seen it being used and clearly wanted to do more of it. And by the time Greg Stafford and I had talked about it, it was kind of like, yeah, this really should work. There's plenty of things that we had to do to make it work, but the basic structure was kind of there from the beginning of when we really wanted to do a game. Making decisions is always, that's what gameplay is really all about, is making decisions. And they're only interesting if you can't make all of them. So they're constrained decisions.
And the fact that these decisions don't just occupy within a vacuum, I think that's one of the things that has really helped really solidify King of Dragon Pass as an amazing game. And as you said, with this emergent narrative, that it's not just you making a choice one season and maybe 2 seasons ahead, that's all that really matters. These are choices that define your entire playthrough. And I think that's kind of lost on a lot of strategy, even a lot of narrative heavy games, where you make a choice and it may affect things in the short run, but then that's about it. It's kind of like just tossing a pebble into a pond, and you just get very few ripples, and then it just gets back to normal.
Yeah, I think the time scale is obviously a game like Civilization has a really broad time scale, but a lot of games don't intentionally take place over many years. And again, going back to some of the stuff I'd seen Greg Stafford do, he a Dragon campaign where it starts with kind of the birth of King Arthur and ends with his death. So you're playing for 75 game years. And that was an inspiration in King of Dragon Pass. I wanted to have characters get born and then grow up and become heroes maybe, or in some cases you'll die of old age. And that scale also helped establish that you were going to have long-term consequences, because it had to be something that could matter 10 years later. So you have to deal with it. Your kid might have to deal with it.
Yeah. And I guess before we move on, then, I guess one final design-related question for you regarding King of Dragon Pass. Was there, besides the game you just mentioned regarding King Arthur, were there any other major inspirations for King of Dragon Pass, whether it's from a narrative point of view or from a design point of view?
Well, I know when we played whatever the first Monkey Island game was, that was inspiration on our victory sequence in a way. Obviously, I'd played Civilization, like I said, castles, but in some ways it was almost negative of how I really wish games would. Why do I have to take notes in a game? I'm playing on a computer. Computers are good at that, and that was how the game's Saga came about. So you could keep track of what went on and not have to keep notes.
Yeah, I know. I'm a horrible note taker in that regard. Like, I can't play a game that requires me to just take things outside. Like give me a notepad in game, give me an in-game map. It's one of the things I think has made really hard for me to go back and try to play those older games that I missed the first time around. I'm talking like first generation pen and paper games, strategy or RPGs like Darklands, and just pretty much just pick any game on GOG's back catalog. I think that kind of fits the bill there.
But yeah, anyway, the Saga was our attempt at that. You may still need to take external notes for some things, but
all right. So I think with that, let's move on to kind of talking about what happened after King of Dragon Pass and kind of the game getting a almost like a second revival on mobile and GOG, and then we'll wrap up our talk talking more about what Six Ages is and what you guys have planned for that in the coming months and into its release, I believe, on the major on PC in 2019. Is that correct?
We're hoping it can come out by 2019.
All right. So, as we said, the initial release of King of Dragon Pass kind of met with not exactly a huge boom in terms of people interested in it, and then as word of mouth spread over the years, it kind of got its cult following. And I know for a very long time, there were people, it was just getting harder and harder to get access to the game. And for fans of Game Wisdom, we've certainly had talks about game preservation and being able to play these older games. So, over like the last few years, of course, King of Dragon Pass got a re-release on GOG, and you guys have also done a mobile version of the game as well. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about kind of bringing King of Dragon Pass back over the last decade.
Well, I guess as soon as I saw an iPhone, it was like, this would be a great game device. And actually, now that I remember, King of Dragon Pass is probably the first sketches I made were actually for that Viking game that would run on an Apple Newton, because it would be something you could carry with you and play. That was quickly dropped, but it was clearly a game that you didn't have to work with a large map, and you would be making choices between 5 or so options, and that would probably fit on an iPhone. So it was basically just a matter of waiting until iPhone development was possible and I had some time to do it, that I tried seeing if I could somehow squish King of Dragon Pass onto basically the original iPhones that were a lot smaller in those days. And we kind of lucked out having a game of kind of exactly that age when the art was good enough that it would still look good on an iPhone, but we weren't trying to take advantage of like a 1024 pixel screen that would be really, really hard to squish down onto, I think it was 320 in those days. So it actually was working, and it wasn't my main project, so it took a while to redo the interface for iPhone, but most of the scripting language and the economic model would run pretty well. So it turned out I could get it onto iPhone, and since it seemed like, well, just porting it was not good enough, we also added a whole bunch of new scenes and some new art, and I think that came out in 2011, which was like 12 years after the first game.
And when did King of Dragon Pass get put onto GOG?
I'd have to look that one up, and the people always were wondering, well, how come you can't just make it a downloadable game? And that's because the original game, we really didn't like copy protection, but we also didn't want to have our game stolen. So we had the pretty minimal form that you had to have the CD in the disk drive, which also is kind of a feature in those days because people didn't necessarily have big enough disks to copy a CD, believe it or not. So it was kind of good for both of us. But by the time people were asking about downloadable games, you probably had enough storage, and you may not have a CD drive to put the thing in, so it was kind of a big problem. And GOG was actually somehow able to patch that, because we had no access to the development system we used had actually been discontinued before the game came out. I think they stopped support in like 1998. So we were always really worried that somehow Apple or Microsoft would break things and we'd have no way of getting the game out at all. luckily that never happened, but we couldn't rebuild the game. So we were really happy that GOG could somehow patch the thing and could distribute the original game. And so that was kind of running alongside. I think it came out after the first iPhone version.
And as you said a few minutes ago, regarding the iOS version, kind of going back over Kingdom Dragon Pass and new content and new scenes like that, I guess, now obviously the control scheme interface is obviously different going from mobile to PC, but in terms of, I guess, getting a chance to do almost like a second take on the game, how did A Sharp kind of approach, like, I guess, where did you want it to go in terms of going from PC to mobile and kind of bringing it back in 2011 as opposed to 1999?
So certainly I'd done a lot of work in games between those two, and there are a lot of things I was really hoping. There's decisions that you'd make in the original game that turned out there's really no point in making this, because you're always going to, there's no value to being anything other than the correct value. It's not really a trade-off. The standard decisions in the game are trade-offs, and if it's not a trade-off, don't make the decision. Yep. So I was hoping to streamline a lot of those. Some of them I was able to remove, and there's a few other parts of the game that just seemed like they're still a little more complicated, but they were really hard to rip out, so they might still be there. It was an attempt to modernize it as much as one could without having to go and rewrite like 500 different scenes to deal with something you might want to, a fairly minor change could still be impacted everywhere.
And I want to elaborate on what you just said there, Dave, regarding having those choices, that they're always good. Like there's always just one best answer for, so it's not really a choice. Because I've talked about this before on many of my design pieces about the challenge of avoiding false choices in video games, where either a choice is either so good that why would you take anything else, or it's so bad that just taking it is handicapping the player. And it's very easy to get into that mindset that that all choice is good in games like this.
Yeah, or should I go left or go right?
Yeah.
You didn't tell me which one
exactly.
I would want to do, so yeah, there weren't that many. It turned out there were a few. I think there was one of your initial conditions that somehow I was supposed to do something, but it didn't. So I just deleted that one. You already had plenty of options in the clan questionnaire. There's no point in like fixing it, because just you didn't need 10 decisions when you had 9 still.
Yep.
And some of that reminds me, we also found some. There's one important potential scene that we were fixing a different bug about a month before we shipped King of Dragon Pass on CD, and therefore we never noticed that we'd broken this other scene, and we ended up fixing that for iOS. So if you played the original or the GOG version, you cannot see all the art, but you will be able to in the iOS version or the later versions.
Now, one thing that I remember when I was looking up King of Dragon Pass on mobile and kind of, again, doing that second take of it, was adding in more guidance for the player. I believe you guys had in a tutorial mode for the mobile version, or just like some basic information there. And yep, go ahead.
It's oddly, we had a tutorial in the original, but it was in the printed manual because we were in a box, so we figured you should have a manual. You're going to get good value here. And the tutorial, you'd read along on the paper, and you'd still have a tutorial, but it had no on-screen presence, and that was clearly not an option for iPhones. So we basically took the same tutorial and presented it. But it's I certainly learned more about tutorials since then too.
Oh yes, and that could be a good 30-40 minute talk right there if we had the time today, because it is very hard to do a tutorial for any kind of strategy game, even more so with a game like King of Dragon Pass, where you have, again, these choices that you're making that you may not see the full repercussions for who knows how many seasons down the line. And that's always been a challenge, even for someone like myself when trying to get into a new strategy game, is that knowledge that I'm going to make this choice, but then is this choice going to actually mess with me 15 turns down the line? I'm already going to be forgotten that by then. So I'm going to lose, and I may not know why I lost.
Yeah, we did intentionally put a sequence in that original tutorial so you could see consequences of your actions that would take place in about 9 months.
Mm-hmm. Now, I guess in terms of redoing or altering the tutorial, how did A Sharp approach kind of trying to guide a new player into this kind of design?
Well, the new approach is basically what we tried for in 6 Ages. King of Dragon Pass, it was really too late to do much about. And in 6 Ages, which is the spiritual successor, it uses basically the same mechanics in a different part of Glorantha. The King of Dragon Pass tutorial had its own flaws, but it was also difficult to implement. It was very fragile. We were trying to keep people on rails, but still give them the illusion that you can do whatever you want. Mm-hmm. And it was actually pretty easy to go off the rails and break the tutorial. So my first idea was to completely flip it around, and instead of telling you what to do, sort of to comment on what you were doing. So when you went into the magic screen, it would start describing your options there. As you chose the options, it would describe what they did. I kind of internally call that the Clippy interface, if you remember good old Microsoft. Was it Word that had Clippy or something? Anyway, I'm not a Windows user, but it's easy to mock Clippy. But it is a context-sensitive thing. Looks like you're about to launch a raid. You should have more than one warrior. And that actually, that worked very well. It was hard to break, but it's also, here's some great trees, and we're going to tell you all about the trees, but you don't learn about the forest. Mm-hmm. So we also added a tutorial that sort of takes a slightly different approach, and that is quite guided. It's also quite short. It's much more on rails than even King of Dragon Pass, because we really want to tell you this is a forest. It's built out of these trees. You have a forest, so you have a war tree and you have a farming tree. We'll tell you about them later when you play, but you need to know that they're there because that's the forest to be playing in. So we basically ended up with a 2-tier approach, and I think it ended up working much better because you could use the tools of each to tell different parts that you need to know.
Mm-hmm. And as you said, that on rails versus off in terms of tutorial design is such a challenging decision to make when it comes to building your tutorials, because I have played, as you said, David, I've played strategy games where the tutorial is just strictly hands-on. Take your unit, move it here. Congratulations. Now click here to attack. Yay, you win. And now you have no idea what's going to happen when you actually play a match against someone, because it just told you the absolute bare bones essential, or even just bare bones basics.
Yeah, in a different game, I would also try to design scenarios that you give progressive disclosure, and we don't show you magic first, for example. But that was also very difficult to. There's no way to cut down the game and do that. Yep. So there's a little bit of progressive disclosure in our tutorial, but it would be nice to have a real training scenario, say. But the design didn't really lend itself to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's not just a problem in King of Dragon Pass, but it's just really an issue that's indicative of any multiple system strategy game. Have you had a chance to look at any of Crusader Kings or about Universalis from Paradox Interactive?
Not really, more than glancing, no.
Yeah, those games are just massive to learn. They're those kinds of titles that if you really love them, you'll get easily 100+ hours out of them. But for someone brand new walking in, they can be a nightmare to try and figure out, because as you said, you can't really trim a game like King of Dragon Pass or a strategy game down and say, okay, this tutorial is just going to be about combat and nothing else. But then your economy influences your combat and your military. But no, we're not going to focus on that. Or we're just going to focus on research, but we're not going to talk about how your commerce works, or how you build your cities. And it's kind of that weird nature that you want to drill things down, but you still have to keep them into the whole of your design.
Yeah, I've worked on an awful lot of games where we're never really happy with the tutorials. Um, you got to do them, but they're hard to do well, I think.
Yeah. I guess one last tangent, then we'll move on talking about Six Ages. I think that's one of the reasons why a lot of Let's Plays have become kind of the stand-in for tutorials for some of the strategy or more complicated games. Because I think they allow a player to essentially explain the thought process of playing the game as opposed to just the raw mechanics of saying, I'm going to click here, I'm going to push this button. You'll usually get the entire thought process of, I'm doing this because I want to influence Y. And then I want to influence Y because my goal is this.
Yeah, and a lot of before and after as well.
Yeah.
You sort of have infinite space to present the info.
Yep. All right. So I think with that we are just at an hour. So we'll move on to our final topic then, talking more about Six Ages. So I figure maybe another 10 to 15 minutes should be more than enough if that works for you, David.
I think so.
All right. So with that said, we've spent the last hour talking about the history of King of Dragon Pass. We've talked about the design and, of course, bringing it back. But, of course, A Sharp is working on the spiritual successor that we've talked, or we've kind of hinted at over our last talk. So, with that said, for people watching this right now, either live or recorded, what is Six Ages for them listening?
So Six Ages is another game set in Glorantha where you're leading a clan to survival. Again, you're playing a clan. The story will take place over dozens of years. The big difference from King of Dragon Pass is it takes place in a different part of Glorantha, and it takes place, you could say maybe 2,000 years earlier, back when the gods were still walking around. So you're basically in what King of Dragon Pass calls the Mythic Era. So the situation is very, very different. And you're playing a group of rider people who were horsemen but were driven out of their city up in the north when the glaciers came. Glaciers in Glorantha, of course, are because the ice gods are warring with your own fire gods, and your guys are losing. So you're basically refugees, and you've been over the generations, you kept having to move further south as the glacier and the cold kept coming, and the world may be coming to an end because nothing's stopping the glacier, and people who worship those gods are coming up from the south, and what are you going to do? And that's where you're set in the first game. And ideally we get to make 5 more games where you did survive, and you get to see what happens at another major episode of Gloranthan history.
And as just a quick tangent, I just want to say I love when games have that extensive world building and lore to them, because I think it just adds so much to the depth and kind of how the impact of these choices matter to you.
And you're also basically dealing with, you'll see the same gods you were dealing with in King of Dragon Pass, but you're not actually worshiping them. So it's going to be a little bit of a different look.
Assuming that, are you going to be using a similar art style, or because of like the change in the period, that is the art style going to be different in Six Ages?
It's being executed by different artists, but we still use the same approach of there's a style for the present, which is that European graphic novel look, and we have there's still a distant past, so that has more of the woodcut look again. And then yes, there's still another world because that's part of Glorantha, and that's clearly different from the other styles.
In terms of the general gameplay loop, I guess where is Six Ages similar, and like when does it end and kind of become its own thing compared to King of Dragon Pass?
It's I know everyone likes to say gameplay loop, and I'm not sure we have one in the normal sense, but yeah, you make decisions and you see what happens, and then maybe you have an interruption with the story. It's by and large the same because by and large it did work. We added some flexibility. There's now something we call ventures, which are sort of a utility action. King of Dragon Pass, you could feast, but that was like one button on one screen, and that was something you did sort of as a leftover action, maybe in King of Dragon Pass. Um, in Six Ages, you have a whole lot of choices that we lump under ventures. They're all kind of major actions. You get only one a year, unless you can build your way up to two a year. But you have additional flexibility of choices you can make that directly affect the economic model, and then you go back to the stories that happen as time passes and will influence everything. But gameplay is largely the same. The way hero quests work is somewhat different, both mechanically and because you're not really traveling back to the realm of the gods, because you're sort of in the realm of the gods, sort of, kind of. I mean, you're still growing crops and raising horses and cows, and there is another world, but the sort of myths being in the past is not quite the same thing in our take on Glorantha here. But by and large, we've expanded combat a little bit, so there's more choices. But I thought pretty much the game did work. The fact you're making story choices and they were tied together by an economic model, and that's what we kept because it let us tell a nice story again.
Mm-hmm. Or in terms of the basic resources, is there anything different in terms of the economic model in Six Ages compared to King of Dragon Pass?
It's somewhat similar, but again, we're telling a little bit of a different story. In King of Dragon Pass, you had to worry about your farmers and your warriors, and they each had their own morale. And in Six Ages, that didn't seem like it was a major conflict that would happen. So Robin and I decided we'd have the 7 families that are members of your clan, and each of the families may have their own agenda, and there's a little bit of family politics you have to balance, mostly by trying to keep them on your clan circle. They like that. You don't always have to do it. It's a trade-off like any other. If you have all the families represented, you probably have better family politics, but you may be lacking in other areas, so you have to decide what possible consequences do I want out of that. Clans are not being treated exactly the same. They have now, you can influence them instead of just liking you like they did in King of Dragon Pass. You can have influence because they fear your might. Of course, the opposite is that they mock you. You don't want that. They can like you or they can fear you, and these are both things you can strive towards. Mm-hmm. And there's some other clan relation things that come out as the story progresses that are kind of spoilers, so I'll leave it at that.
All right. And one thing that I wanted to bring up, and I kind of forgot about this in our last part, as we said, Six Ages is being developed first for iOS. And I was just wondering, with the original re-release of King of Dragon Pass, how well did it do on mobile? I'm just curious about how well that game was received.
It's I don't remember the exact figures, but I know that iOS is definitely our most profitable market. So I definitely wanted to make sure we brought Six Ages to iOS. Mm-hmm. And it has it's been out for I think 2 weeks now. Mm-hmm. Yeah. On the App Store, and we're pushing a way to get it other places still.
Great. Yeah, I know I have an Android device, so once it's available on that, I'll definitely be able to check it out.
Okay. Can't promise when. Sorry.
But I do find that very interesting because I've spoken to many independent developers over the last few years about that kind of balance or the challenge of going from PC to mobile and vice versa with their games, and how certain genres tend to thrive better on one versus the other. And it's interesting how well King of Dragon Pass has done on iOS. I guess, do you have any thoughts or insights about kind of like the market for the game on mobile?
Well, I'm not really a marketer. I do, I think the fact that it involves a lot of reading, it's an interactive story, one way of looking at it. And I don't usually read books on my computer screen. I read them sitting in a couch with something held on my lap. And that also describes how you'd play King of Dragon Pass or Six Ages on an iPad. So it wasn't originally designed necessarily for that, but I think that's in many ways the ideal platform. We certainly intend to take advantage of bigger screens. Apple coming out with their 12.9-inch iPad was kind of annoying in some ways because we hadn't completely prepared for that size screen, but was probably a gift that we're now like pre-evolved for desktops, or I shouldn't call them desktops because they're all laptops, but old habits. Whatever you call them, that they're not mobile, except laptops are mobile too.
I guess one other question I have for you, David, regarding, I guess, future support for 6 Ages. Now, obviously, developing it first and foremost for mobile as opposed to the old school computer does afford you a little bit more in terms of growing the game out. Does A Sharp have any plans for continued support in terms of new content and new stories?
I think our first update has already added 3 new faces, for example, and we'll have more art and more scenes in updates to the first chapter. Uh, I'm sure we'll have additional stuff there. I would like to have our focus also being on the second game so that you can continue your story with like a ton of new content, all new art and all new stories. So it's probably our biggest focus is to do the second episode, but we're not going to abandon the first episode.
Mm-hmm. And that sounds very interesting about having these different games and kind of continuing your story through them. And there's definitely a chat in there about kind of developing a game as an ongoing series. Because it's something that we've seen other developers approach. Probably the most famous example would be Mass Effect from BioWare, with planning their game out as almost a 3-act narrative between game 1 through 3. And with 6 Ages, how, I guess, if everything goes well accordingly, like, how many games do you like plan to like build around the series or the specific framework?
Well, I was thinking 6, which is sort of where the name came from. I'm not entirely sure we're taking the model of other games. As usual, I'm not always familiar with things that run on devices I don't own, but I know I don't want to do like a Telltale game where you chop up one story into 6 episodes, that you have to play them all in an order to get the whole story. The idea is if for some reason you run into third game first, it's a totally reasonable game and you can enjoy it and like it and then decide you want to go play the prequels. If you play them in order, then you've continued the same clan over the years and that make it even cooler. But each game is going to be entirely self-contained and should be fun in its own right.
And it really reminds me of a game that I'm sure, I don't think you've probably heard of this one, David. I'm sure the audience either watching us live or recorded it and play, but there's this game called 7 Grand Steps by, I think his name...
Keith Nemitz.
Keith Nemitz, yeah. I spoke to him about it, and it sounds very similar to that approach, but of course a major difference being it was just one game with essentially 7 different game modes, as opposed to having 6 different games kind of play out over the course of a grand narrative.
Yeah, I don't think I got past his first step.
I think I got to like step 2, and that was where I failed. But yeah, that was another very interesting game, and kind of tying this all in for this cast, like games like 7 Grand Steps and of course Kingdom Dragon Pass and 6 Ages, they're very unique beasts in terms of their design structure, and I'm glad to hear that it's found that second life on iOS, and hopefully if things go well, the PC audience will get a chance to experience it in the foreseeable future.
I hope so.
All right. For anyone watching this live right now, if you have any final questions for David regarding 6 Ages, this is going to be my official last call, because we will be wrapping things up probably in the next 4 or 5 minutes. But before we do that, for you, are there any aspects behind 6 Ages, whether it's from a design or production standpoint, that we didn't touch on that you'd like to bring up now?
Certainly it was, I think you were asking about expansibility or extendability, adding new stuff. And when I first did King of Dragon Pass, that was never a goal. And it turned out to be fairly hard to add scenes, even though, it was easy in one sense to write them, but just the game structure did not support that. And that was something that I made sure in this game I wasn't going to make that same mistake. So it's going to be much, much easier to add whatever kind of content we decide to add without having to go through weird gyrations to oh, we can't add new variables? That's kind of annoying.
Yeah, that's interesting because I would think that a game like King of Dragon Pass would be open to a lot more supplemental content in terms of like new stories, new events, stuff like that. Is it from a programming standpoint
Yeah,
or from?
as a design, it's totally doable,
Yeah.
but there were just some restrictions in how we'd implemented the scripting language that things are more hard coded than they needed to be. In retrospect, I think we were overly concerned about certain optimizations back in the 1998 era, maybe when computers were, they had less capacity than probably the first iPhone, really. Those aren't constraints anymore, so I don't have to follow them.
All right. And a child in chat asks, where did the name come from for calling it Six Ages?
It was, I think somehow, it was because I was at a game convention in Germany, and someone was describing how his tabletop gaming group would play 6 scenarios of a game, and then they would move on to the next one, so everyone got a chance to run a game. So somehow 6 ages came about from, well, if I was going to run 6 scenarios of something, what would that be? And then it also seemed to more or less fit with, there were 6 sort of big Gloranthan mythological events that we could take the same clan through. So, and I guess it's also St. Augustine's 6 Ages of the World, if you're into medieval scholarship or something, which I wasn't at the time, but I probably had heard of it.
Great. And I guess this question probably was a little too soon to say, but does A Sharp have any ideas for a future game beyond Six Ages, or is it still, way too soon to be thinking of that?
Well, it's going to take a while to do the next 5 if there's enough reception to do them. And we could take the same engine and use it on different settings, or there's certainly other Gloranthan games I'd love to make as well. So as long as people like them, I'll try to keep making them.
All right. So I think with that, I think it's time to wrap things up for our cast. So for people watching this right now, so we said Six Ages is currently available on iOS, with plans, of course, to come to various platforms. For people watching this right now, what platforms are kind of like tentatively planned for Six Ages?
The only ones we're at all committed to right now are Mac and Windows, but we don't necessarily want to stop there.
Okay. And like we said, it's still in the future, so no hard release dates yet.
No, I wish I had better news for that, but we don't like to talk about things that aren't fairly definite.
All right. And I think with that, that's all the questions that I have. So, David, before we go for the evening, do you have any final thoughts or anything you'd like to say to the fans to wrap the cast up with?
I guess thanks for staying with us. I was actually sort of surprised that we're selling as many copies as we did back in 2011 of King of Dragon Pass. It's a completely different market now, where we have to compete with free to play, and that's very, very tough as an indie. So thank you guys.
All right. But I think with that, we will wrap things up, and hopefully in the future, I can have you back on. I'm sure there are other design topics we can talk about, and especially to catch up more with what's going on with Six Ages.
Sure.
All right. So with that said, we're going to wrap things up for our little design cast here. Thank you so much for anyone watching this either live or recorded. Before I do my little social media thing, for you, David, if people want to follow Six Ages or A Sharp, are there any social media related places you would like to mention?
So probably our website, sixages.com, has the most information about the game, and our Twitter feed at Six Ages is our best social media to follow. It's our most active. You'll find other ones on sixages.com also.
Great. So, for myself, if you're watching this right now and would like to follow me, you can find our written posts on game-wisdom.com And be sure to check out our Discord channel linked down below if you'd like to talk about game design and industry topics. And if you're watching this record right now and would like this talk ad-free and release a bit early, be sure to check out patreon.com/gwbeiser to get VIP access. But that is going to do it for our stream tonight. I'll be back on later tonight for some more talks. And again, David, it was a pleasure hanging out with you this afternoon, and definitely the best of luck with 6 Ages going forward.
Thanks, Josh. It was a lot of fun.
All right. So, for you folks watching this live recorded, that's going to do it. Check back for daily discussions on game design here and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. Until next time, have a great night.